My name's Maze Wallen, my pronouns they, them, and I'm one of the directors of Wayward Strand from the Ghost Pattern team.
Cool, and I'm Cameron, and among other things, I did the accessibility. I was an accessibility consultant on Wayward Strand.
Very cool. Very much appreciate you both making time to do the interview, just because, McW is coming up, and I think accessibility is really important, and I'm really excited to sort of hear what Wayward Strand's been doing. So, first up, getting into it, really hitting hard with the intense questions. What does accessibility mean to you? / what does it mean to the team?
I mean, honestly, to me, accessibility is just doing our best to make sure that as many people can participate in a thing as we can. Like, that is the short version of my views on what accessibility is.
Yeah.
So?
I think we're definitely on the same page as far as many people as possible being able to access the game and play the game. And I think there are a few reasons for that. One is that majority of the team are from marginalised backgrounds or people who are traditionally pushed out of games. And, we want the experience of our game to be different to that. And then I guess we view our game as having a place in the industry where we want to change what people's perceptions of games and of Australia is. And to do that is to try to get it in front of as many people as possible.
No, I think I like the idea of it's the idea of a lot of people sort of being able to play as many as possible. I think that's totally fine. I am curious about the idea that you were talking about. You wanted to change the idea of what games are. Like, I might be misquoting that slightly, but I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, so, when we talk about Wayward Strand and we talk about how it's inspired by interactive theatre, it's not just a narrative-based game, but it is entirely narrative. People have a lot of conceptions around it. Either it's, it could be gamers who are like, I'm not really sure about narrative games, and then they start to play it and they get converted, as we've been talking about in the team. We watch streamers and we watch gamers be like, I didn't think I'd be into this, and then they are. But also, my grandparents say that they're not tech literate or that they don't know how to approach a video game, and we don't see many games that could have 3 or 4 generations playing at once, And we'd like to see our game, played by grandparents and their grandkids, or shown at narrative festivals or that kind of thing. So the core design pillars of our game have been around using narrative to move around instead of having to use WASD, which would rely on some amount of gamer intuition, or not necessarily having gamer mechanics where it's like, this character phrased that thing in a specific way that means that it's probably a quest line, or that's probably a fetch quest, or, these kinds of things that become intuition when you've really immersed yourself in gamer culture for so long. And then I guess the other thing is that we don't see many Australian games in the general games industry that are actually set in Australia and use our cultural touch points. And I think that as far as the Australian creative scene, whether they're artists or in marketing and communication or any kind of media, they're not seeing games as accessible for them because they're not showing stories that are relatable. And I guess it's kind of tangentially related to accessibility, or at the same time quite core, because we are trying to reach people who aren't always included in games, and you have to do that from the ground up. It can't just be about telling a nice story or one that isn't told much. It has to actually be accessible as well.
And Australians, we do tend to get relegated to stereotypes as representation, which can be like quite frustrating. But your point about sort of trying to like elderly people being able to play the game is like a significant point. And one of the things that I saw recently is it's quite a selfish way to frame accessibility. But there's a question that you can pose to gamers or game devs, quote unquote, and it's like, at what age are you going to stop playing video games? You're not really going to pick an age. You're not going to say, well, when I hit 80, I guess I'm just going to stop, because at that point, you know, what can I do? And so at some stage we're going to get old, and we're going to start getting certain disabilities. Things are going to start being inaccessible. It's just what happens. So I think the idea of not ruling out these player bases, which I think a lot of game developers unintentionally do, like that's really lovely to hear. Like, it makes me really happy to hear that you're really being inclusive in how you're framing accessibility. So well done on that. I would be curious to know, I don't know if a lot of developers necessarily know what the process is for getting a consultant on board and what that's like. So could you speak a little bit to how that works, and, you know, how you're approached and what it's like, I guess, to sort of get content? Yeah, so just the whole process. Sorry, I'm just rambling a bit.
I mean, it's hard to say, partially because Wayward was my first like proper professional gig in this field. Like, I have given accessibility feedback on games and stuff like that before, but not on a hired, salaried kind of position. So I can't say too much whether what I did with Wayward was typical in the industry, but this is also the kind of thing where I think it really is just going to depend on who the consultant is, who the team is, how everyone works, and what exactly it is people are wanting. Because, I mean, in terms of what we deliver, it's advice, documentation, reports, that kind of thing. So what that will look like will just be dependent on who's involved, if that all makes sense.
Yeah, I guess so. But let's say
Cam, I think Cam was really flexible as well, and I guess like that's part of being a specialist in accessibility, right? Is being flexible to different ways of working or things like that. But you know, we delivered builds when there were significant updates that we wanted accessibility feedback on. And, you know, throughout our production, Cam was also able to help us to prioritize things as well. Like, you know, as much as we kind of did want Cam to come in, shake everything up, and then have us do everything that they wanted us to do, obviously that's not going to happen as much as we want to. Yeah, and
I know budget is finite, and because like Wayward did make sure to give me like a fair deal. Like, I do just want to point that out. I won't say how much unless they want me to, but like, yeah, the Wayward team wanted to make sure I was compensated for my time, which I really appreciate. And that also does mean that hours are finite.
Yeah, cool.
Because budget is finite.
Yeah, I think, yeah, as a union founder, I feel like we paid Cam well for a consultant. But yeah, I think as far as the implementing of everything that you listed, we'd love to have implemented everything, but those hours add up more, or even time. But yeah, I think there were a couple of ways. The way that you spoke through what to prioritize was really good for us, and it kind of highlighted how I think you talked about this concern a little bit, that the stereotype is that an accessibility consultant comes in and just has to fight the entire time. And I feel like we worked together really well in that we wanted you to come in and we wanted you to rip the game to shreds, basically we wanted, that criticism. But yeah, we really met in the middle really well, and it wasn't like it wasn't a setting where people were trying to clash or anything like that. We were really working together really well.
Yeah.
I do think this is a field where it's nice to be able to come in and be idealistic, but there just has to be the element of pragmatism, because there are definitely examples of indie games out there who very much prioritize accessibility and just poured all their energy into making just incredible games, just games that can be played with eye tracking, that kind of thing. Can't think of any names off the top of my head, unfortunately, which is unfortunate because I probably should be able to, but it's been a long day, so
I feel fine.
Well, another indie game that released recently is Lost and Hound, which was made in WA, and that can be played. That's fully blind accessible,
Wow.
which is that's pretty cool. And I think that, while we aren't fully blind accessible or anything like that, we managed to meet some bare minimums that a lot of other games don't, It's kind of what I said to you, Lauren, when you asked for the interview, and I was a bit like, we're not outstanding in any kind of, you can't play it fully blind, or you can't, I guess you could play it fully deaf if you would still be lacking some things, but there's as much as we could fit in, which is more than nothing, which is cool.
We did get nominated for, we were an honourable mention for the Actors for Accessibility, so.
It's pretty significant.
Yeah.
That was the thing when I reached out to developers asking, whether it was for an interview, whether game keys being featured in this event. A lot of them, not just you, have just outright said, no, we don't think we're good enough to be part of it. And I'm not necessarily in a position where I can argue with them, where I'm like, no, but you do have some features that are good and should be sort of discussed. And I think that's quite a sad precedent to just outright say no because you feel like it's not enough, because just incrementally showing that you are thinking about it and there are things you're doing to get there, and then even discussing the experiences of what you think you could have done better is really invaluable stuff that I think more people should hear. And it makes me sad, just even the idea that you were close to saying no, or some devs have just said no outright, because I just think it's good, just the features that you have.
I think I have a couple of things to say on that. The first is that, it is very easy to just fixate on what you haven't been able to do. But having some accessibility features and support is better than not having any at all. So, one thing that a lot of accessibility consultants will say to devs, in development, if there are significant problems and they are looking at making games accessible, say you, because of earlier design decisions and implementation, that kind of thing, if you can't get text size to the minimum it should be to meet accessibility standards and all that, make them as big as you can without breaking stuff, just because doing that is better than not. And sure, it's not ideal, but it's an improvement.
Yeah.
Speaking of text size, that was something that Cam came in and was like, here are the standards and here's how you can test things, which was really cool. And, everyone on the team has tried to keep accessibility in mind, but obviously we didn't have a champion on the team, and that's why we needed to hire Cam, because you need someone who's focused on it. So even if we have all of the Microsoft or Xbox guidelines, having someone there, it also shows, I guess, also as a team, even if it's just money, that's a really tangible investment into it, and it encourages you to actually action those things. But text, so having the right contrast, and then also scaling. We hadn't thought about that before, but that was one that was not too hard to implement for us because we had quite a robust UI system. There's a lot of UI in our game, so it's a system that has to be pretty robust and scalable. I saw a streamer on the weekend pretty excited about that one, which is cool. I think it's good for streams, right? Because sometimes they have really tiny screens and they have to make the text big or something.
Yeah.
Well, I haven't played too much of the final game yet. I did play a bit on Switch, and it was good to have that option there just because Switch screens are tiny.
Actually, it's like UI, from what I've seen, not a lot of games actually have it scalable. And yeah, with the Switch, most of the things I've heard about it is, it's the text is too small, I can't read it. So it's pretty good. You're talking about, I guess that was like an easy fix for you to do and something, you just chucked in kind of thing. I guess, what are other ways that you prioritized different features? And if you had an example, I'd love to hear it too.
As far as prioritizing features goes, like the main things I would say to look at are how easy it is. If it's something you can do very quickly, then just get it done and be on your way. There's also how many people would affect and how severe that impact would be. So, and it is just kind of a balance of all those things. So if you were to decide between, say, the text size thing, which, like text being a bit too small, like not tiny, but not as big as it could be, like that would be a feature that would affect a ton of people. But it probably wouldn't affect most of them that much. Whereas, say, if you had a game that you had to button mash to get through, that would affect some people very, very severely. So if you need to fix one of those, figuring out which it is like, that's part of the challenge, I think. And I wouldn't be able to give a clear answer as to what one I'd pick because it's all very contextual. But yeah, basically, as far as prioritization goes, I would look at the simplicity of the fix, how many people are affected, and the severity of that impact. So pretty similar to just general risk assessment stuff, that kind of thing.
Right.
Except accessibility.
The severity of the impact was one that, as a team, we hadn't thought about before. And I think that's, seems obvious, but you need a specialist to kind of say, no, this is how that works. Like, because I think it's very easy to be, here's an easy win, and then thinking about how many people is this going to affect, it's kind of counterintuitive because we're always told how small amount of people are disabled or anything like that, or, that it's only going to be a minority. And it's not, but also thinking about it as, will this allow someone to play the game that couldn't play it before in that kind of severity impact is a really cool way of reframing that.
Right. So an example that was just mentioned is like button mashing, whereas, I hear that, I don't necessarily think, this is a difficult feature that might block things for people. But yeah, in thinking about it a bit more, I could see that sort of if you have sort of struggles with particular cognitive functions, that could pose like a pretty significant issue. So when it comes to things that aren't immediately obvious, what's the process for kind of trying to figure out, is this a feature we need to sort of, is this going to impact people, or, you know what I mean? Because it can get really sort of granular with so many features and trying to make everything fit perfectly. Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. If you look at the various game accessibility guidelines that are out there, they are all quite broad. Like they will sometimes mention specific things, but they'll usually have those in the, if you really want to like make a game successful thing, look at these, like the very hard stuff. But the reason most of them are broad is because every game is kind of its own beast as far as accessibility goes. So as far as what could, some things are going to be bigger issues in certain games. So like things such as text size and all that are going to be a lot more of an impact on games like Wayward, where text is extremely, extremely important.
I think what Cam's kind of alluding to, or how I interpret that, is that that's why you need to hire a consultant, or you need to hire someone who's thinking about your game and has the accessibility expertise, because you can't rely on really generalized things. Like you need someone to really be critically looking at your game.
And I mean, that is something Maze can attest to, because there were specific things that I mentioned, like, for example, voice acting, because like I know that's really expensive and Wayward has a lot of text, but because things just one of the things of Wayward is because everything is always moving, time's always going forward. There is like one of the issues, the big issues that came up was if you couldn't read text fast enough, you would miss stuff. And voice acting was a big way to get around that. There were other things that were suggested, but like voice acting in Wayward was a big accessibility one, and it's the sort of thing that most people aren't really going to think about as far as accessibility goes as well. But
yeah, the voice acting like helps to define the pace on a creative design level, but also I feel like I'm saying, but also there's this non-accessibility thing, but that's how it kind of it comes together. And I think it's what people aren't realizing, is that things that are accessible actually make great design decisions also.
Yeah, because like I know for a lot of time when people think of what an accessible game looks like, they think of the likes of The Last of Us with its endless menus of various options and tweaks and changes that you can make to gameplay, and that stuff is all great, but a lot of accessibility can be just inherent in the game's design.
Right.
So in the case of, say, Wayward, the text in the game, like all of the dialogue and stuff like that, is just automatically in a sans serif font, which is a lot easier to read for people that have conditions like dyslexia. And like there are fonts that are specialized for that kind of thing, and there is debate over the merits of that, which I'm probably not going to get into right now, but just having that font by itself as the default, that alone makes the game more accessible, but it doesn't add to the options.
One of the questions I did have was, what do you think makes good accessibility? But you're kind of answering it, because it's interesting you bring up The Last of Us, because a lot of the people I've talked to about accessibility have always touted that as like, this is like peak accessibility. This is exactly what we need for accessibility. But from what you're saying, what I understand is simplicity and then default options that are just inherently accessible. That's also good accessibility. Like, am I...
Yeah. Like, I'm not going to knock The Last of Us on accessibility. Like, it is generally considered a gold standard in this industry, and for good reason. It is really impressive. But I think a lot of people get too caught up on the presence of options and not enough on just inherent accessibility and the inherent design, which is something I have seen people talk a bit more about lately. But it is also just personal opinion of mine, in that if you can do that, then that's good, because like one of the things with the big menus and stuff like that is if you have information processing disorders and that kind of thing, like I do, I have autism, it can make the big menus overwhelming and overloading and all that. And I think, and like, again, not knocking The Last of Us, they did a pretty good job of organizing that stuff. If you can make something inherent, then it's good to do that. But again,
Definitely.
nothing wrong with what Naughty Dog did.
Yeah, they definitely struggled with that on the audio side because so many audio accessibility options are really easy, like having more granular volume options. So instead of just SFX and music, also including UI and also including background sounds and also including VO and having it,
I was really glad to see that in the game.
Yay! Yeah, having those actual options there. Those are things that, from a system design point of view, were largely already present. So was not hard to do that, and I was very like first in, you know. And yeah, even as an audio person, I'm always like, there's got to be output options. And I saw a streamer go, output options. And then that's also, we didn't even think about that as an accessibility feature, but having those different output options to people's different setups has been really helpful for people as well. But yeah, designing that menu, it's definitely the messiest menu out of all of them.
I do think how you did it is the best way to do it, like having the main volume sliders there and the more specific ones in the submenu. I am reluctant to just say more submenus good, like don't have too many layers of them. But I think what you have there is fine.
So you mentioned, I guess, so this feeds into my next question. So, you know, complicated menus are one challenge. Another challenge you've mentioned is sort of cost versus the amount of time and budget that you have. What are the other considerations and challenges that sort of come with trying to design something accessible?
One thing that comes to mind is friction between the game's premise and accessibility. And there was a bit of that in Wayward Strand with the whole everything always going forwards, no pausing stuff. And I feel like there was some compromise there, like having the notebook.
Yeah, there was one feature that we didn't manage to get in that was meant to be a compromise for that, or not compromise, but a solution. And that was, is it Fire Emblem that has the log?
I think it was Fire Emblem, the one that you used as an example.
And also you can click on the dialogue and it replays, which I was like, that sounds cool. And we have the data for that, but we weren't able to implement that feature. But another decision was, so there was a point where the notebook didn't actually pause the game. So pausing the game when you bring up the notebook means that the player can take as long as they like to read through anything that Casey's written down. And we also communicated to Jason and Georgia, who wrote the notebook entries, that this is not just an expressive tool, but it's also an accessibility tool. So actually write down what's happened. And we made the timer much clearer, but apparently it's still not clear. For the video, the game came out 4 days ago, so we're still getting feedback. But yeah, well, that timer should maybe be clearer. And I think releasing the game has reprioritized what our post-release patches were going to look like as well, as far as like, I mean, the priorities were always going to be either game-breaking bugs or accessibility options. And so far, no one has asked explicitly for any more accessibility options other than saving happening more often, which would relate to that time thing that you're talking about as well, even if it's kind of in an indirect way. But yeah, that time thing, sorry, I'm talking a lot, but I think that Cameron's totally on the money there, that the only problem, I think, or the only like hurdle when it comes to accessibility that isn't money, which, you know, is just that you didn't budget it right, is that if it conflicts with the core design of your game. But even then, we still manage to figure things out, and that's where having that ongoing conversation with an actual specialist, I'm just talking, but and not reading some guideline and being like, oh, we can't do that, and dismissing it. You know, you have to actually hire a person, you know?
Yeah, I get you.
Yeah.
So I guess that kind of feeds into the next thing, which is, you know, what are some of the other things that you would want other developers to know when they're sort of starting their own accessibility?
A few things. One, like, start as early as you can. The sooner the better. Because having to add accessibility to pre-existing things is a lot more expensive and takes longer than just doing it in the first place. But at the same time, if you have left it too late, like, well, it isn't too late. You can still, like, while you can't, I don't want to say make it perfect because nothing's perfect, but if you can't reach the sort of ideal you'd like, some improvements are better than no improvements. Because, like, I know that my involvement in Wayward started quite late. And, like, they were still able to, like, while the game isn't perfect accessibility-wise, and the team themselves will acknowledge this isn't me just trashing my clients.
No.
The end result is just that much better than it would have been anyway. Like, honorable mention for accessibility, the actors, and, like, again, I was brought in this project later than would have been ideal. And that is not, again, not criticizing Wayward on this. It is just,
yeah,
a lot of devs just consider accessibility too late. It is a thing.
I think what we thought was that we cared enough that we could do it. And I think that's why I keep saying, like, no, you have to hire someone, is because that's probably the main lesson we learned, is that you can't just care really hard.
Or have someone to champion it, from what you're saying as well.
Yeah.
That's what you want other devs to know, is just please do something early and get someone else to, like, actively be the person to do it, kind of thing.
I must say it is pretty funny for the clients to be the ones saying hire people.
Yeah, well, it's about having, like, a tangible investment in something. You know, it's like when you pay for a concert ticket instead of just signing up to the free Eventbrite. If you pay for it, you're going to turn up, right? Or you're more likely to. If you make an actual investment in a person, it's not just paying for them. There's now this person in your emails or on your Slack, or, you know, it's this extra accountability that you can no longer just be like, oh, it'll have to be the next sprint, or I'll have to put it down further down the priorities or anything like that. There's now this person.
Right. Yeah, it's actually a good way to contextualize it. Like, you can't, there's someone you need to email now. Good luck. Yeah.
Yes.
So I guess on that, you know, only got 3 more questions left, so you're both doing fantastic. You mentioned the notebook, but are there any other features of Wayward Strand that you really want to highlight that you're kind of proud of?
I mean, in my case, a lot of it is quite boring stuff, like getting voice acting in, the notebook, the audio settings, that kind of thing.
It's not boring. It's cool.
The voice acting is a huge one. Just that, you know, I think every indie team who considers voice acting also considers putting it on the chopping block, because it's expensive. There's always a lot of people. There's the actor, there's whoever's editing it, there's writing it, there's implementing it, there's mixing it. Like there's, maybe there's a recording studio, which is in our case, there were 4 recording studios. So it's always something that people think about chopping, and it being such a major accessibility feature kind of added to the scales to tip it into, no, this isn't something that's choppable.
Yeah. I think that would have been like the one place where like there would have been like, I don't want to say conflict or friction or anything, because that implies like there were arguments, stuff like that, but that was like the one thing I think I'd push back on. And that was mentioning that voice acting would make this more accessible. And because like when there wasn't voice acting, the text still progressed at a fixed rate, regardless of like whether you could read it or not. And I knew that would have been an issue in Wayward, like a big one. And the voice acting goes a long way to fix that. So
we didn't quite get in robot voice acting for the menus like The Last of Us has, but I thought that would be cool. We did look at some options, but we didn't get it in. I reckon that the text scaling is pretty cool, because there is a certain amount of design that has to go in to make sure that it doesn't all clubble itself up.
And also just making sure that there isn't any. The problem with that feature specifically is voice lines are not a fixed length, and there are games out there, I'm not going to name examples, but there are games that had text scaling, but they didn't test it on their biggest voice lines, so they just went off screen.
Oh no. Oh, it's not great.
Yeah.
Oh, so Wayward doesn't have that. Wayward scales well. Nice. Fantastic.
Yes.
Nice to hear it.
We'll see.
I wouldn't know.
We'll see.
I haven't gone to spend much time with the final projects, but like what I've seen so far looks good.
I've been glued to Twitch so far. No text that weirdly crops off screen.
It's promising. All right. I'm just going to agree
so
that
far.
There's no issue whatsoever. So that's all good.
It's software. You can't say that it's never going to happen.
Yeah.
Something might happen. We have a couple of Linux users.
Really?
Yeah. Well, you would know if you've got Linux users, because they tell you. And it's working for them, which is cool, through the Steam Proton thing. But if any bugs were to happen, that's probably, well, any bugs that we don't know about or are totally not predicted, that's probably where it would happen.
Linux.
Anyway.
That's fair. Yeah, okay. Those are some like fantastic features to highlight. And I don't think it's boring to talk about like menus and sort of how you're sort of incrementally implementing them. I think it's really relevant to know, because sometimes those things are really difficult, and like framing them as like being kind of like mild or boring. It's like, no, it was significant. It was big. It was great.
There is something that slips through the audio settings sometimes, like, sometimes I just won't notice that a particular UI sound hasn't been put under the UI group and it's making it into the SFX group. So every now and then, we found this with the trailer team because they were doing so much recording. They were like, I'm trying to mute this sound and it keeps coming up through the other channels. And I'm like, oh, whoops. So there'll be a bit of that. But yeah, if there's not bugs now, there'll be bugs when Windows updates or whatever. Like, it'll happen.
Bugs are fine. I'd be curious to know what both of your thoughts are in terms of what you think we need more of when it comes to accessibility. And if you say voice acting, it's going to be hilarious, but true.
But now I want to say voice acting.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to suggest voice acting as an accessibility thing for most games. It's just that the core concept of Wayward and the fact that it's a very text-heavy game made it in terms of accessibility, a fairly important feature. And I mean, part of that is just we want to convey information through as many channels as we can.
I think that's a really big one, though, is that you're trying to convey the text through, or not text, but the information through as many mediums or senses as possible. Like, we have to do that with everything. We have to do that with the news or activism or advertising, you know, and it's the same in games. And it's such a multidisciplinary craft that we should find that really intuitive. Or advertising, you know, and it's the same in games. And it's such a multidisciplinary craft that we should find that really intuitive. You kind of hinted at it earlier, Lauren, that, you know, maybe we are getting to the point where a certain amount of accessibility is baseline, you know, and that, yeah. I don't know what I'm saying.
I would say we're at that point. It's just that usually when people talk about accessibility things, they won't phrase it as such. Another classic example of this, text size being too small. It is a thing people will joke about, complain about on Steam forums and all that. They might not necessarily connect that to accessibility though.
Yeah, there are basic things like both of you have alluded to that you can just have, and the idea of just having something like really core and baseline to the game is what most games need. Yeah, like text scaling, like subtitles if it's very audio based, like having like more options in the UI. There are some really fun audio options that I saw. There's a painting game called Chicory that one of the audio options is to get rid of wet sounds because it like really horrible, you know.
Symphonia?
Yeah,
Is that the one? Yeah,
that's the one. So just like more options.
We should have that.
Do you have gross sounds in your game?
They're not very loud, but the residents do eat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Terrible.
Yeah. I mean, that is also just kind of another example of how accessibility and all that is very contextual, because that option probably doesn't make a ton of, like, in terms of bang for buck, it probably doesn't make a ton of sense to implement that in a lot of games. But in a game like Chicory, where the main form of interaction is going to create wet sounds, it will be a thing that people will take issue with.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's another thing. When thinking of things to prioritize for accessibility, how often the issue will occur. So, is it a thing that happens like at one specific point, or something that will happen throughout the game?
And actually, you're all right. We should label things more as accessible rather than just kind of like a thing, or just like, haha, wish the text was bigger, when it's actually, an accessibility issue. No.
Yeah.
Yeah, everyone's like, AAA games are all making their text really tiny.
I will add a caveat to that, though, in that there doesn't necessarily accessibility options in an accessibility submenu. There are a couple of issues with that, and it can make things harder to find, and like having things in an accessibility submenu, a lot of people will look at that and go, oh, I'm not disabled, I don't need to go into that. There was one game where I forget exactly what one it was AAA, where people thought the game didn't have subtitles because subtitles were not in the audio menu, they were in the accessibility menu, and they never looked there.
So it's inherently inaccessible putting it in the accessible menu. Wild.
So yeah.
True gamers look through every single menu.
100%.
Just saying.
So true. So right.
So like, so I think what I'm trying to get at here is like, think of more things as the accessibility benefit of more things, but don't like pigeonhole them as accessibility. Like, it's both.
I'm going to ask you both a final question, and it's a very intense and scary one, which is there anything else that you would like to add?
The scariest question.
It's so vague. I'd get confused.
I talked about old people. That's what I wanted to talk about. And, well, that's what I was worried about missing. and I talked about them.
Love
so
old
that's
people.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the fact that you might not be disabled now and not need these options now, but come 60 years or so, you almost certainly will.
What is the phrase around that? It's like temporarily not disabled or something like that.
But it's essentially, you're not disabled yet.
It's quite threatening, isn't it? That's sounds like
Phrasing it like that, but like just in a more serious sense. The older you get, the chances of you being disabled in one way or another increase.
I feel like people are so rude to people older than them. Like, really not understanding, like, really making fun of their, like, cognitive abilities. But when you get older, those things just slow down and you can't help it. And it's so, like, sad to see so much, like, put down and shame because some people just can't react as fast as others, you know?
Or they're just different, you know? Like, the mechanics of Wayward Strand are quite similar to the mechanics of an audiobook, you know, or a normal book. And I think that just means that they're more relatable to people who haven't found games accessible to them before, whether they're old or any age. I'm second generation game sound designer, you know, so it's kind of like people are getting old. Game developers are old.
It's also quite cool that you can say that, by the way.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Pa's just like, I don't know if I'll be able to get to it. And I'm like, nah, he'll be fine. He'll be fine. He loves his iPad. Everyone's grandparents love their iPads or whatever once you set it up for them, if they need help setting it up. Like...
Yeah, because it's pretty generally intuitive, right? And like big screen. Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, programming and the games industry in Australia started in the 70s. And if you had people who are like 30 years old working in games in the 70s, how old would they be now? 60? 60? No, 80. I don't know how to maths. They'd be 80 now, which is actually older than my grandparents. So, you know.
Yeah, like, even with accessibility, like, there are like, the push for that goes back like quite a while, longer than you would expect. Like, I wouldn't be able to like put proper dates there, but like, people talk about accessibility as if it's a fairly new thing, but people have been fighting for that stuff for, I would say, decades.
Really?
It is not a new discussion, if that makes sense. It's just a discussion that's gaining enough prominence for people to start paying attention.
Yeah, which is good. It's sad that it's taken so long, but it's good that it's gotten to this stage.
New normal.
Yeah.
So much that people who have accessibility features don't even want to count them because they're just normal.
Yeah, subtitles. Everyone loves subtitles now, so aces.
I have subtitles all the time. We were fiddling with our Google TV last night and there wasn't an option between small and medium. We need like medium or something.
Or just more options.
It just needs to be on a fader instead of on an enum. How does a normal person say that? Instead of on a switch? I don't know. Whatever.
Slider?
Yeah, it needs to be on a slider.
Slider.
Yeah.
Instead of options.
Yeah. All right. Are you both, like, emphasis, thank you both so much for giving me your time, especially after work hours. I very much appreciate it. Are you both comfortable for us to leave it there?
I believe so.
All right.
Yeah.
Awesome.